The envelope had been sitting in Mr. Gerald Harmon's office for 18 months before I ever knew it existed. My mother had sealed it herself, written my name on the front in the careful unhurried cursive she used for everything important, and handed it to him on a Tuesday afternoon while she could still drive herself to appointments. I found all of this out on a Wednesday morning in late February, sitting across from a man I hadn't seen since I was 12, while outside his window the city moved through its ordinary business without the slightest awareness that something was being returned to me. Let me back up. My name is Nora. I'm 28. My mother, Diane, died of ovarian cancer 6 years ago, when I was 22 and finishing my last semester of college. She was diagnosed 2 years before that, and for those 2 years I drove the 4 hours between my campus and our house in Asheville. I sat with her through infusions. I learned which anti-nausea medications worked, and which ones didn't. I became, without anyone formally asking me to, the person who kept the household organized while my father, Warren, increasingly failed to show up for that job or any other. Warren had met someone. Her name was Claudette. She worked in the leasing office of a commercial real estate firm, where my father handled account management, and she was 31 years old to his 53. I found out 7 months before my mother died. I did not tell my mother, because she already knew. She told me so herself, quietly, one afternoon when we were sitting in her garden, the one she'd spent 15 years building. She said she didn't have the bandwidth to fight on 2 fronts, and she had chosen the one that mattered. She was right. She was almost always right about things like that. 3 weeks before she died, she asked me to sit with her in the bedroom while Warren was out. She held both of my hands and told me she had spoken with her attorney, a man named Leonard Marsh, who had handled the financial and estate affairs of her family for nearly 25 years. She said, "Nora, whatever happens after I'm gone, you are covered." I made sure. Trust Leonard. I nodded. I told her I loved her. I didn't ask for specifics because I was 22 and I could not fully accept that I was going to need them. She died on a Friday morning in November. Warren grieved with appropriate public visibility for about 8 months. Then Claudette moved into the house. Then 14 months after that, they married in a small destination ceremony in Charleston. I received my invitation 11 days before the date. I attended because my mother had raised me to conduct myself with steadiness regardless of the conditions around me, and I was not going to let the occasion be the moment I stopped. Claudette was warm to me in the performative way of someone who has already decided the relationship will be on her terms. I was pleasant in return. My mother's photographs came down from the hallway. Her garden was dismantled and re-landscaped. Her recipe notebooks, which she had kept since her 20s, disappeared from the kitchen shelf. I visited infrequently and kept the conversations light. Then on a Sunday evening in February, my father called and asked me to come for dinner. I believed it was a reconciliation attempt. I drove up, sat down at a table that no longer felt like any table I had ever eaten at, and listened while Claudette, speaking in the measured tone of someone who had rehearsed this. She said $380,000 sitting in a protected account was essentially selfish when the family had financial needs. She used that word. Selfish. She was wearing a silk blouse I was almost entirely certain I had seen in my mother's closet. I looked at my father. He had set down his fork. He said, "Your mom would have wanted you to take care of the people who matter to me now." Something went quiet inside me. Not grief. Something older and colder than grief. I said I would think about it. I finished enough of my food to look composed. I drove home and called Leonard Marsh's office at 8 the next morning. His assistant picked up. I gave my name, and Leonard came on the line within 40 seconds. I told him what had happened. He listened without interrupting. Then he said, "Nora, your mother built for exactly this. Come in tomorrow. You don't need to bring anything. I have everything here." Leonard Marsh's office was on the 4th floor of a building downtown that had been there since the 70s. Dark wood, legal volumes, a faint smell of coffee and old paper. He was 72, methodical, with the unhurried quality of someone who had seen enough human behavior to be unsurprisable. He stood when I came in, shook my hand and set a thick manila folder on the desk without opening it immediately. Instead, he slid a sealed envelope toward me. My name on the front, in my mother's handwriting. I had not seen her handwriting in 6 years. I had to press my back teeth together before I could breathe normally. He said she had prepared it 19 months before she died. He said she had told him, and he read it from a note in the file, that she hoped she was wrong about what she was preparing for. Inside the envelope was a letter, 5 pages, both sides in the same handwriting she'd used on birthday cards my entire life. She had moved her inheritance, money from her own parents' estate that had never legally or morally belonged to Warren, into a protected irrevocable trust in my name alone, completed 14 months before she became too ill to manage the paperwork herself. The trust carried specific conditions. No spouse of Warren's could access it or petition against it. No amount above $15,000 could be withdrawn without my signature and a mandatory 96-hour waiting window, a clause Leonard confirmed she had specifically requested to prevent anyone from pressuring me into a fast decision. That was not what undid me. The last 2 pages of the letter were not about money. She wrote about watching me grow up. About the way I used to leave glasses of water on her nightstand before she ever asked. About a road trip we'd taken to the Outer Banks when I was 17, when she let me drive the last stretch of highway in the dark and pretended the whole time that she wasn't nervous. She wrote that I had spent my life making sure everyone around me had what they needed before I checked whether I had what I needed, and that she was asking me, formally and in writing. She told me to finish the graduate certificate I had put on hold. She told me to travel somewhere that would require me to be uncomfortable. She told me to build something I cared about and commit to it without measuring it against what anyone else expected of me. She signed it with her first name only. Diane. Not Mom. Like she was writing to me as one adult to another. I sat in that office chair and cried in a way I hadn't permitted myself since her funeral. Leonard placed a box of tissues on the corner of the desk and said nothing, which was, I understood immediately, the precise right response. That evening I drove to Asheville. I did not call ahead. I brought a sealed copy of the trust documents Leonard had prepared and left them in an envelope addressed to Warren and Claudette on the kitchen counter. Warren opened it while I stood in the doorway with my coat still on. I watched his face as he read. I watched the moment he understood that my mother had seen all of this coming and had answered it, calmly and thoroughly, from 18 months in the past. His face went through several things. At the end of it, he cried. Not, I think, from guilt alone. I think he cried because he finally understood what kind of woman he had failed to show up. Claudette put her hand on his shoulder. I picked up my bag and walked out. I haven't been back. The trust is intact. I completed my certificate in archival studies last spring. I booked a flight to the Azores for September, an archipelago my mother had kept a travel magazine photograph of on her desk for years. I think about her every day, but the quality of the thinking has shifted. The grief is still there. It will always be there. But underneath it now is something else, something that feels like being known completely by another person, not despite your flaws but including them, and being protected by that person even after she was no longer able to protect herself. She was not a woman who raised her voice. She handled everything the way she handled her illness, with patience, precision, and full intention. Claudette demanded what my mother had left me. My mother had already responded, long before the question was ever asked. Have you ever considered what it means to be loved not in the moment, but in advance by someone who understood exactly what was coming and made sure you wouldn't have to face it unprepared?